especially the Senate at this time assembled, that thou wouldest be pleased to direct and prosper all their counsels to the advancement of thy glory, the good of thy church, and the safety, honor, and welfare of all people. All this we ask in the name of Jesus Christ, our most blessed Lord and Savior. Amen. Amen. Together the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
The Senate is in session.
The messages from Her Excellency the President. Announcements by Your Honor the President.
We have announcements. Minutes of our meeting held on Monday, March 11th for deferral. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I beg to move that the aforementioned minutes be deferred.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting held on Monday, March 11th, 2024 be deferred. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye. Those against please say no. The next the ayes have it, those minutes are accordingly deferred. With further announcements, I have indications of late arrival from Senators Tate, Senator Drakes, and Senator Maynard. We have further announcements. Welcome some young people from our youth parliament. There are John Delaney, who is General Director of the South Caribbean Youth, the Methodist Youth Organization in Southern Caribbean. Cashon Brewster, Barbados Community College, and Claire Berry Rullock of the Lester Vaughan Secondary School. Welcome. I trust that you'll find our sitting interesting. You've chosen one of the most important debates in the annual calendar of our Parliament, that is the approval of the expenditure for all of government, and of course associated policies and programs. So I trust you'll find it enlightening. Welcome. Welcome.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Senator Cummins. Papers.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I am commanded to lay the following documents. The Fiscal Risk Statement for 2024, the Department of Emergency Management's Comprehensive Disaster Management Policy for 2022.
Reports from select committees, questions to ministers, requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or citizens of the Senate, moved by minister.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of Standing Order 45-2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that Standing Order 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye?
Aye.
Those against please say no. Meeting sides have it. Standing Order 45-2 is therefore suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the following bill, the Appropriation Bill of 2024. This is the reading for the first time of the Appropriation Bill 2024.
The question is that the Appropriations Bill 2024 be read the first time. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 3. In the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Appropriation Bill 2024.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to begin my presentation today, Mr. President, by acknowledging, as you have, that we have a number of young parliamentarians here joining us, and I want to acknowledge them and for their commitment to observing the proceedings of this legislative body, both in the other place and here, starting today in the upper chamber, which we call the Senate, casually. The work that you are observing here is of seminal importance to not just the people of Barbados today, but your generation in the future, because many of the policies that we will be articulating over the course of the next 3 days and what you have heard in the other place over the past few weeks in the estimates capture both the immediate, the short, the medium, and the long-term visioning of this administration for Barbados. And the implications of many of the decisions that we make today will be those decisions that you, as the future of our nation, will have the benefit of and be able to benefit from. And we want to commend you for demonstrating an active interest in these matters. There are countries, Mr. President, as you know, where our youth are not necessarily sitting at the table where decisions are being made, and decisions are being made on their behalf and in their name that will have long-reaching implications for their future. And that, Mr. President, is exactly what this year's estimates of expenditure really capture. What is the future Barbados that we want to live in? What does the Barbados of the future look like? What are we dealing with today, Mr. President? The continuum that is government, the continuum that is development policy, the continuum that is international relationships that help to impact on what we do nationally, and how those things impact our people today, how we are projecting and assessing that they will impact our people tomorrow, and how we are projecting that the generation coming behind us will be able to either benefit or be burdened by the decisions that governments of yesterday and today will take. And that is where I want to begin my presentation today, Mr. President. Mr. President, if you were to go through, every Barbadian were to take the time to go through the estimates of expenditure for 2024 to 2025, it will tell a story. It will tell a story of, on the one hand, cleaning up that which we inherited and positioning Barbados and our future for where we want to take it, dealing with the short run and the scenarios that we're presented with now, both external and domestic, and those things that we vision, that we see a Barbados in the future looking like. Because I can tell you, Mr. President, that as a Barbadian myself, I was not a young parliamentarian. I never joined youth parliament, but I know what it is to be a young activist myself. And I know what I wanted to see as the Barbados of my future. I know the Barbados that I wanted to see evolve. I wanted a Barbados that was visionary, a Barbados that was thinking about what kinds of policies and what kind of development constructs we should be positioning policymaking to be able to deliver on, for me as a young person. I agreed with some things and I disagreed vehemently with others. And as a government official now, I now have the opportunity to have my hand to the plow, to correct, to initiate, and to vision the long run. That is what, Mr. President, this government is about. That is what today's debate is about. And that is what the estimates of this upcoming financial year will share. Mr. President, I want to, if I were to put a thematic framing around my comments, it would be what goes in comes out. What goes in comes out. I grew up, Mr. President, in a Barbados where I have never known what it is like for my mother, a working class Barbadian who worked at the St. George Secondary School for all of my work, all of my life. I never knew what it was like, Mr. President, to have to pay to go to primary school. I never knew what it was like, Mr. President, to have to pay to go to secondary school. I even went to university, Mr. President, undergraduate and postgraduate. I did not know what it was like to have to go and pay at the point of receipt of education to pay for that. That is, Mr. President, the visioning of a government that started a policy, continued a policy, was interrupted by a government, but reinstated by a government, because that's the future that we see. And so I, as a Barbadian, understand that a part of my heritage, a part of us as a government and the development construct that we as a people, successive governments have always seen, is that our education trajectory positions us for a development pathway that we have set ourselves on, Mr. President. I know what it is like as well to be a Barbadian who joined the Foreign Service as a young officer at 21 years old and found myself dealing with international environment policy under another member who is sitting here now, at the time who was the line minister in this honorable chamber, who now sits here and is shaking their head because they feel that I date them whenever I say things like this. But I know what it is like, Mr. President, but that leadership, Mr. President, which focus on international environment policy, has now translated into a climate agenda. And you will see that as we go through these estimates. How does the climate crisis correlate to international environment policy as far back as 1997? How has Barbados as a government ensured the continuity that has been important to our people, Mr. President? We have, in these estimates, begun the process of looking at what goes in order to make sure we can capture what comes out. And what goes in, Mr. President, by way of revenue, whether that revenue comes by taxation or that revenue comes by raising debt, is what comes back out. And what comes back out is to fund and to support healthcare, education, our investment in climate adaptation, climate mitigation. What comes back out, Mr. President, is our investment in transport and works and making sure that we have roads that we can drive on. What goes in, Mr. President, is a direct correlation with what comes out. And the question, Mr. President, that was asked historically was, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That goes back, Mr. President, to the notion of what goes in must come back out. And I want to begin by saying there has to be a correlation in this country and a conversation in this country around the relationship between taxation, the relationship between debt, and what we want to be able to have access to from our governments and what we have become accustomed to as Barbadians, Mr. President. I, Mr. President, grew up in my mind, always thinking analytically, always thinking about what was before me and what was seen and what was not seen. And I confess, Mr. President, that one of the things that drew me to the Barbados Labour Party, as opposed to the Democratic Labour Party, was the fact that I hated the dumbing down conversation. I really hated it, Mr. President. The notion that you spoke to people as though they didn't understand things that were before them. The notion that you spoke to people and tried to be simplistic and score cheap political points without getting into the details of what really people needed to understand. The notion that you did not want to connect poor people and small businesses to what goes in must come back out. The notion that you did not want to educate and to share with people how government uses its revenue. So that when, Mr. President, we talk about healthcare, if I need to go into the Queen Elizabeth Hospital or I need to go to a polyclinic, I don't have to pull my pocket, Mr. President. And that is something to which we have become used to. It is an entitlement that we associate almost as a right. But those services that we are accustomed to have a cost, and those things correlate to what goes in. And this country is having a conversation under this government about what goes in by way of revenues, what revenues we raise, what debts we are assuming, where those debts come from, what they're being used for, Mr. President, and how they benefit people on the one hand, and our development trajectory at the big picture level. I am going to deal, Mr. President, during the course of my presentation today with both of them. First of all, Mr. President, I want to start by looking at expenditure. What does our expenditure look like? What are we spending on? So I'm looking at the out, and then I'm rationalizing it about what the in is. Because there is a conversation Mr. President, that is emerging in this country where the government is spending more than it can raise. But at the same time, in the government spending more than it can raise, what are we spending the money on? Let me start, Mr. President, first by what we project during this upcoming financial year will be the expenditure of this administration. This administration is expecting, Mr. President, during the course of this year to have an increase in expenditure of approximately $862.2 million. This is around 26.2% from the 23 to 2024 figure. And we now have a revised figure in total, Mr. President, going from $3.294 million to $4.156 million. This is what is projected for expenditure. Wages and salaries, Mr. President, constitute a significant part of that. And when we speak about wages and salaries, Mr. President, the reason why we speak about wages and salaries so early up is because unemployment or employment in the country, the largest employer in this country is the government of Barbados, the largest employer. And as a consequence, our expenditure is always going to be highest on things like wages and salaries. We also have, Mr. President, a projection that we're likely to spend $62.8 million on goods and services. And I will come during the course of this presentation on what that expenditure looks like. Current transfers, Mr. President, current transfers relate to what government transfers from central government to state-owned enterprises that have a specific mandate in a specific sector to do specific things. Current transfers are expected to decrease, and they're expected to come in to somewhere around $61.8 million. Now, if you recall, I'm going to pause here for a moment, current transfers decreasing. The reality of it, Mr. President, is that in 2024, you are seeing a decrease in state-owned enterprises transfers from central government because when this government came to office in 2018, we found a scenario where central government's debt was in shambles. We had a fiscal crisis that the government had to attend to, but we also, over the course of the successive periods of months and even years, found ourselves in a position, Mr. President, where state-owned enterprises, because the way in which they are constructed, they have a level of independence from central government. So they use their balance sheets to borrow, they go to the market, they go to the commercial banks and they borrow monies, and those things oftentimes are not positively or even negatively correlated to central government's expenses. This administration, between 2018 and 2019, came to this honorable chamber and into the other place and passed sweeping legislation ranging from central bank to public finance management to ensure that those things can be brought to book. And why, Mr. President? Why? Because over the course of the period 2018 to 2019, 2019 to 2020, and even 2020 to 2021, Mr. President, we as a government found that state-owned enterprises had debts that had been assumed, not brought to book, and then had to be settled. So anyone who tells you that the debt in this country is unsustainable, they're not telling you, Mr. President, the whole story. They're not telling you that what we found and what we had to fix and what we are projecting for the Barbados of now and the Barbados of the future must take into account the baseline of our financial position. What is our financial position, Mr. President, at central government level and state-owned enterprise level? This government has wrestled to the ground the fiscal indiscipline of the previous government, both at central government level and at state-owned enterprises, to the extent where we have decreasing transfers as capital transfers from central government to state-owned enterprises. But I will come to what I want to focus on in a few moments. Interest payments, Mr. President, in 2024 to 2025, we will have interest payments that are expected to be in the vicinity of around $790.4 million approximately. And why, Mr. President? The Honorable Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister of this country, who has led the charge of financial and economic transformation in this country, has talked at great length over many, many years now, 6 years almost, about this matter. Borrowing money, money in, what goes in must come back out. Borrowing money, if I go to courts, Mr. President, let me know if you use courts. Let me use a credit card. Mr. President, many people in Barbados have a credit card. You know what it is like when December rolls around and those fees roll over into the next year. You know, Mr. President, what a 21.5% interest rate looks like. You also know, Mr. President, what a 4% interest rate would look like and what the difference is that would make on your loans before the bank. If you go to the bank to consolidate your debt, you got a credit card here, you got an unsecured loan there, and you pull those things together in a dedicated debt instrument, and you go to the commercial bank. The commercial bank says, okay, I can pull these things together, and then I'm going to lend you the money to pay them off because your interest rate on your existing instruments are 21%, 11%, 15%. In some instances, you may get 10%. We're going to lend it to you. You're going to secure it by an insurance policy of some kind, and then you are going to get a lower interest rate because we have secured the capital. And the interest rate that you are going to get, Mr. President, could be 3%. If it's a mortgage, in some instances, it could be 5% in other instances. And so by lowering your interest rate, you then lower your interest payments and lower the cost of capital. The government of Barbados is doing what we do in our homes and in our personal finances all the time. The government of Barbados is seeking to lower interest rates because money saved on interest payments means that there's more money spent on the outbound side to service social services, health, education, and the kinds of things that I have already made reference to. And so increasing or decreasing interest payments will be important to this government. In contrast, Mr. President, in contrast, the previous government borrowed at interest rates that were at best extortionary and at worst almost criminal. When we came to office in 2018, Mr. President, there was a bullet payment that we had to make in a very short space of time. And that interest rate from, I think it was Credit Suisse Bank at the time, would have increased and increased and increased. And why did it increase, Mr. President? There's an objective measure about the performance of this government on its fiscal management in terms of expenditure and its management of debt. What is that objective assessment, Mr. President? Ratings. Ratings. They rate us and they rated them. They rated them in continuous downgrades to our sovereign debt. They rated them by way of interest payments, Mr. President. Interest payments that were tied to debt ratings, which continued to slide, and interest rates went in the opposite direction. In our case, however, we have had upward ratings increases and downward interest decreases. And that, Mr. President, is the strongest statement of this government's management of Barbados's fiscal affairs. It has meant, therefore, that even though you have a wider contracting global economy as a result of things that have happened, like a pandemic globally, certainly there's no government that preceded ours that can say the world shut down for 2 years. There is no government, not the last one, not our government that preceded the last one, not the one before that. This government, with upgrades in our credit ratings, with strong commendations coming from every ratings agency, and the confidence that that has generated in inward investment, and the confidence that has generated from lending agencies by decreasing interest rate, have had a shutdown of the world. Nobody had to ask us if that was true. We lived it. All of us lived it, Mr. President. But yet, we still see the positive outlook and the positive commentary on this administration's fiscal management of our affairs. The only people in the world who don't see this are those who have a political and a partisan agenda, who aspire to be in a position to repeat the poor management that they had the last time on another occasion. What would have happened, Mr. President, if the government, who could not manage a 2008, as they would have it, global recession, and we found ourselves spiraling downwards? What would have happened if that was the government that was in office when the world shut down for 2 years. And yet they wish to speak with some great authority, moral authority, with some kind of expertise as to what the government should do and should not do. This government that could not manage a mere recession but would wish to tell us and to school us on how to manage a global shutdown. But we didn't even just have that, Mr. President. We didn't just have a global shutdown for 2 years. We had the leading driver of our economy shut down with it. I happen to know I was there. Had to keep your head above water at least for 2 years. Hold straight. Don't let it die completely. Position it so it could take off a little later on. When the world opens back up, that those words could even have been used by us is as bizarre as it could come, Mr. President. But we didn't just have that. We didn't just have that, Mr. President. In an apocalyptic moment, we then had the first hurricane in several years. And then we had asphalt that when we woke up in the morning, Mr. President, and we looked outside, we thought, what manner of sorcery is this? What has happened to the world? You couldn't have dreamt it, Mr. President. But yet, despite those things, here we are still with every objective agency giving a favorable review to this government's policies. Every objective review. So, Mr. President, I am in this role as that little girl who did not like the Democratic Labour Party's dumbing down of a population by trying to tell me the sky is pink when with my eyes I can see it blue. I am standing in this place as that little girl, now a government official, who would want the Democratic Labour Party to tell me that the sky is falling over Barbados' fiscal management when every other agency says not. But here's what we are spending on in terms of managing the government's resources. Has it been perfect? Have there been things that we wish could have been done differently? Oh, for sure. And I will speak about some of those things in my own ministry in a short time. But I'm not there yet. Mr. President, during the course of this last year, we also looked at a range of capital expenditure. Capital expenditure to focus on new development pathways that were important to us as a government and that captured the imagination of our people and inspired our young people. Mr. President, this morning, I live in St. George, and this morning, I had to make a stop on my way here. My own road, I wish it was being done, but it's not yet done. But when I drive down Market Hill, the road's smooth, smooth, smooth. Smooth, 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 Mr. President. When I drive down Salters, the road smooth, 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 Mr. President. When I drive down by the bell just below Roberts Manufacturing, the road smooth, 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 Mr. President. I, as that little girl, never knew those roads in my lifetime to be smooth, ever, Mr. President, not ever. I used to avoid going to the plant place down in the Bell for all this time because I couldn't drive on the road. The road was awful. Market Hill, I used to avoid going that road because when I had to leave home and go to Warrens or any of those areas, I used to try to avoid the traffic in Charles Road Bridge and going around. So I would go across the top road. Cottage, I used to hate to drive across Cottage Road, Mr. President. The road smooth, smooth, smooth. Bridgecourt Terrace, the road smooth, 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 Mr. President. I was driving and coming down, but I used to go and get dog food from the place down when it was in Laura Estate. Now I move up to Lears. Both Laura Estate and Lears, the road smooth, 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 Mr. President. And that's just in the areas that I would be taking to leave my house. So, Mr. President, when I hear the Honorable Prime Minister, when I hear the Honorable Minister with responsibility for transport and works talk about an accelerated mill and pave program, when I see in the estimates that we have a road rehabilitation program for this year, around $15.0 million and $30 million allocated overall from CAF, the Inter-American Development Bank, I don't just see what comes in by way of debt, Mr. President. I can see where it's going out. I can see where it is going out because my car tells the story. My shocks on my car, Mr. President, they tell the story. Mr. President, you know that sometimes I'm on the phone, in my car, and a person who knows me well will know where I am based on how my car phone sounds in the car because the road is in a state. I have had a diminishing of that happening as I have seen the roads rolled out, Mr. President. I have seen a diminishing of that because I got more smooth roads to drive on, Mr. President. The roads looking better, and not just major roads, because I will tell you, I used to get real confused. How many times we can do the highway though? I want us to see some of these secondary roads being done because I don't drive on the highway. I live in country. So I want to see some of these small roads being done. That is happening now, Mr. President, under this government. And it ain't just happening in the constituency of the minister with responsibility for Minister for Transport and Work right before an election, as happened under the last government in St. Philip. It ain't just happening now, Mr. President, in certain areas. St. Thomas, Mr. President, is one of those constituencies that has suffered because they have always been a Labour Party stronghold historically. For the first time, Mr. President, roads are being done under this program. What goes in is coming out, and you can see it, Mr. President. But, Mr. President, there are those that would also wish to say that only some people are benefiting and not others. Let me deal with that here now. Right now. I am wasting the time on it, Mr. President, at all. You have historically seen, yes, large companies, because it is called an accelerated mill and pay program. So you are fixing the roads on an accelerated basis, moving ahead very quickly. And the reality of it is the Ministry of Transport and Works has all the engineers, has all the experts, has all the design services. And when they don't have the design services, Mr. President, they are able to benefit from them coming in. One of the things that others would wish to raise red herrings about, Mr. President, is consultants in the government. Mr. President, one of the consultants helping to advise on our roads program and our capital works infrastructure program is on secondment from the Caribbean Development Bank. They used to be responsible for projects and infrastructure in the CDB. This government, you will not see it in our estimates because they're not paid for by the government. And that will be the case that you will see in many other instances, whether it is the Global Climate Fund, whether it is the International Financial Corporation, whether it is the World Bank, whether it is the CDB, whether it is the European Investment Bank, you will see that all of the experts who have come in as consultants in support of this government's transformation program and our development trajectory are on secondment and being paid by these agencies who are buying in and supporting this government's vision for Barbados of the future. They are being supported, Mr. President, because people see where we came from. People see what we went through. People understood the challenges that Barbados faced, and they have come and lined up to support us. I will speak about how they are supporting us even in energy, Mr. President, because the challenges are real. So let us be very clear that what goes in, whether it is by revenue or by debt, is coming back out. You can see it. Mr. President, the Ministry of Agriculture, in their estimates presentation, spoke about the development of a tissue culture lab. There are those that have spoken about the agriculture sector and what is happening and what is not happening and so on. But Mr. President, the reason I put agriculture so early up in my own comments today is because, you know, I always go back to being a young person, especially on a day like today. And I could kill a cactus. It is the truth. I do not have a green thumb, even slightly. But I have a lot of respect for the people who do. And I want to create the nexus, Mr. President, between the agriculture sector and the Ministry of Health and why these things are important in a high-level framing. Mr. President, I eat everything. The only thing I don't like is okras and beets. I eat everything. I hate okras and beets. I really do. But I like to be able to go to the markets. I want to be able to go and buy the things that I see. But I watch on Netflix. I don't have a lot of TV time. but I was watching TV time, when I go home at night, and I turn off, I try to get my brain to turn off, at least for 20 minutes before I sleep. In order to sleep, I want to watch something silly, mindless, and foolish on TV. So I'm going to lay down and I'm going to read something, watch something foolish. But I don't know what possessed me one night to watch this thing, You Are What You Eat. It's the worst thing I could ever have watched, Mr. President, because that girl who eats everything now is in trouble. Because these people were doing this experiment on twins. I don't know if the Honorable, my colleague from the Ministry of Health, has seen this show on Netflix, but they did an experiment on twins. And these twins, genetically identical in every possible way, and they fed them two different diets, one plant-based and one regular, including meat. And the results were astounding. But in so doing, they also showed the evolution of the chicken industry, the cattle rearing industry, even fish farming in the United States. And they talked about the correlation between industrial practices in agriculture and the health and wellness of people. And I was blown away because I felt as though the next day I was probably going to become a vegan, far less not even a vegetarian. Because the way that I saw this thing evolving, I was horrified. And that brought me then to think about how it translated into a Barbadian context. Our investment in agriculture, our investment in organic agriculture is so critical, Mr. President, so critical. Our investment in the development of new technologies to be able to stimulate agricultural production and to ensure we're able to deal simultaneously with that stimulation of agricultural production while managing pests, pesticides, monkeys, all of those other things that affect open field farming are critical. And they started to show how industrial transformation had affected the agricultural sector. I then came to the conclusion, because I started to think it through, Barbadian agriculture becomes even more important in terms of its investment and transformation capacity for the country because the industrial practices in major economies where we import food from is so critical to health that we can't take it for granted. And here's what I mean. When they showed in that video, Mr. President, what happens in fish farms, it made us understand the importance of open, wild-caught fishing. The fishermen who leave the jetties that this government has renovated, from Concept Bay to Western and Pile Bay, those jetties have all been, and those fishing villages have all been rehabilitated on this government after years of neglect. Oysters, all of the areas, Mr. President, I'm sure that others will speak about that over the course of the debate, but we have seen the transformation of those areas, Mr. President. Agriculture, you saw the Ministry of Agriculture introducing shade houses and to start the important feed program. And now in these estimates of expenditure, Mr. President, we have earmarked the development of a tissue culture lab for $25.3 million to invest in the further development of the agricultural sector in Barbados to increase production, improve yields, and to improve performance, Mr. President. But all of these things at a sectoral level, whether they range from the Smart Energy Fund at $10.2 million, further investment in the Botanical Gardens, $4.0 million, and now I want to come to the people component, these things are critical. This government has also been investing in people. And how have we been investing in people, Mr. President? The expectation is that capital transfers are expected to be at $113.1 million for this financial year. And what are some of the things that are expected to be invested in? The Trust Loan Fund, which I will speak to in my own presentation, at $2.0 million. The Urban Development Commission, which deals with persons in the urban corridor, $1.6 million. The Rural Development Commission, $2.5 million. The BIDC, or Export Barbados, $6.9 million. The Barbados Water Authority, which had the benefit of an $80 million grant going in as investment, and we will see a capital transfer into the Barbados Water Authority of $29.1 million. We also see the Barbados Defense Force and the Barbados Tourism Investment Inc. at $11.3 million. For the avoidance of doubt, the important tourism sector is not captured here as a transfer from central government because The BTMI, which is capitalized from the airport service charge, does not draw on public taxes. It is not drawn from the public purse. Travelers arriving and departing from the GAIA and the airport service charge, there is an allocation that is assigned to the Barbados Tourism Marketing, Inc. for approximately $75 million, and the excess is in the consolidated fund. The BTMI and our tourism sector are financed by tourism activities directly and not from central government. So it meant then, Mr. President, that for this financial year, there was a need for us to close the debt financing gap. The deficit financing gap is estimated, Mr. President, at $1.069.7 million on the basis of the Accountants General, and this is meant to be financed in a couple of areas. Mr. President, these are the major activities that are meant to be financed during the course of the financial year, this year, 2024, and I want to focus on this in great detail, not at a high level, because my colleagues will go into it in greater detail. A subvention, Mr. President, of $100.9 million to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital for its operations. A transfer of $10.4 million for the elderly care program under the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs. That's going to be dealt with a little later on. Invest Barbados, which deals with investment attraction into this country, will be allocated the sum of $8.2 million. And under the CAF program, which I've already dealt with, we have $15.0 million. To the University of the West Indies, education, a subvention of $98.4 million on the one hand for economic costs and $32.7 million for tuition fees will go to the University of the West Indies. This government, Mr. President, the government that reinstated tuition fees for Barbadians to the University of the West Indies after the party that carries Errol Barrow's name and his legacy and speaks in great exalted language about their commitment to education, neither wanted to have education for the University of the West Indies, nor wants to transform the education sector. We will speak about that during the course of today's debate, Mr. President. The Welfare Department, you have heard the Honourable Minister who is responsible for the Welfare Department and People Empowerment speak about the number of persons that they are treating to. You've heard them speak about the transformation of the agencies that are there to deliver people. And so let me speak for a moment here about that. This government in 2018 came in on a mandate of mission critical. Then we got into mission existence, because there was almost an existential crisis. We never called it so, but that's what I call it today. Now, we are on a trajectory of mission transformation. What must be made fit for purpose in a 2024 environment that was not styled in that way when it was first created 10 years ago, 20 years ago? There is no one in this country who believes that the Barbados we live in now is the Barbados we lived in pre-pandemic. There is no one who believes that the Barbados we live in today is the Barbados we lived in when this Barbados Labour Party left office in 2008. There is no one that believes that this Barbados in 2024 is the Barbados of 1966 when we were independent. There's no one, unless you have an agenda to mislead and to dumb down the public. And so what is fit for purpose in this environment is something that occupies the attention of this government. It is for that reason, Mr. President, you have heard this government announce that associated with the transfers to the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs, that the consolidation of social service agencies, the Child Care Board, the Welfare Department, all of those agencies are now to be consolidated, not because this government is tinkering with agencies, but because this government lives under the mantra, face it and fix it, face it, fix it, face it, fix it. What is the problem that we have to face? Over how many ever years have we talked about whether these departments are functioning as they should be? Over how many ever years have we talked about whether people are empowered, whether they have the tools, the skills to be able to deliver, whether they are effectively funded, Mr. President? Is this the mechanism that works best for people, for service delivery? And that is why you may hear the Democratic Labour Party talking about tinkering with agencies, because they want us to think small. They want us to think only parochial. They don't want us to think about transformation. That is not the Democratic Labour Party way, but it's the Barbados Labour Party way to always think about transformation. So we are going to continue, as they call it, tinkering with agencies because they must be made fit for purpose in this 2024-2025 Barbados. They must serve people better than they served them last year, Mr. President. That is who we are as a Barbados Labour Party government. And so our social agencies are being transformed. In my presentation, which I will come to very shortly, we will talk about the next age of transformation in terms of energy and in business. I will speak in great detail about Business Barbados in as much as I can for now. So we have, Mr. President, also further allocations for a change management unit in the Ministry of Education. And that change management unit, Mr. President, is $1.6 million. And let us be very clear as I continue to talk about people. People empowerment, Mr. President, in terms of welfare and so on, those are transformations that keep those who are the most vulnerable provided for. They create that safety net for those who are the most vulnerable. But every economist, every development specialist, every person who has been trained in social policy will tell you, Mr. President, that the way to keep people out of poverty, the way to increase people's incomes is through education, training, and capacity building. How can this government not tinker with education, Mr. President? How could we not touch education, Mr. President? How is that possible? If we are about the poor, if we are about the small man, if we're about people, and education is the conduit through which people's incomes increase and their opportunities improve, how do we not produce those opportunities for people, Mr. President? It is the dumbing down of the Barbados public that the Democratic Labour Party has to stop. It has to elevate its conversation with the public, Mr. President. Stop throwing out these red herrings to keep people excitable, vexed, angry, without showing them how we can bring their position to a higher level, Mr. President, through education. That is what this government says, through making sure agencies are fit for purpose, Mr. President. That's what this government says. That's what we are doing, Mr. President. And so, yes, there is a change management unit within the Ministry of Education, because you can't just bring transformation and major change that benefit people. Mr. President, look, there are some members that sit on this side who today are wearing a tie that I have great objections to, but that's only because of who they are. But I'm going to explain to you, Mr. President, this morning, I would have liked to go to assembly at the St. Michael School to celebrate their girls. No, I wasn't at Spring. I'm Senator Marchant. I'm on run night. You go on there. But here's what I will say in this environment, Mr. President. Here's what I will say in this context. Many people misconstrue why I am so supportive of the St. Michael School and the children at the St. Michael School. Mr. President, I know what it was to be that little girl that didn't have the brand name. I know what it was, Mr. President. I went to one of the so-called top schools, yes. I know what it was to walk into those schools and see all the people driving in their big cars and having their fancy last names, and you know, they went to the fancy private schools. I know what it was like to be that little girl. My mother was the school secretary at St. George Secondary School. Right? I know what that felt like. And so, Mr. President, I am also conscious that today, as I stand, there are young people in St. Michael's School who feel today how I felt then, who don't feel as though they belong, who don't feel as though they are anybody compared to the somebodies that are in our school. Because let's be honest with ourselves, that's how Barbados oftentimes is. You gotta be somebody or know somebody or related to somebody. Even in those schools, you know what it was like to feel that way, Mr. President. So I go back all the time. I go back and I support my school, not because it is my school, but because there are children who are that little girl today that I was a few years ago. I ain't going there, y'all, but a few years ago, Mr. President, they can see that with hard work, with access to education, with investment from parents and support from governments, that you can be anything that you are capable of being, that there's nothing that is too big for you. So I go back all the time, Mr. President, because I'm committed to inspiring them the way others inspired me. Mr. President. So this government will tinker with education because education is what got everybody in this chamber sitting around this table today, Mr. President. Education is what gave us the opportunities to do the things that we wanted to do that we never thought possible, Mr. President. We will tinker with education because the education sector of 2024 is not what it needs to be in 2025 for the young parliamentarians who are sitting with us here today, Mr. President, for those who are on the outside in our schools, Mr. President, and it cannot remain the education sector that I went through in 1987. I had to catch myself. 1987 when I went into secondary school. It cannot be. And any government or aspiring government who thinks so is short-sighted and does not deserve to be running this country because they are standing in the faces of young people whose dreams are no less legitimate than those of us who climbed up those ladders, Mr. President. They're standing on the dreams of those young people. And it is an elitist mindset that wants to hold on to the vestiges of a past that should all along have been put behind us, Mr. President. And I want to commend this government, of which I am proud to be a part, for having the fortitude. I was going to say the testicular fortitude, Mr. President, but I pulled it back. The fortitude to be willing to tackle a subject, Mr. President, that those who sit in exalted corridors and speak in rarefied languages and breathe rarefied air speak about it as if it is untouchable. But it must be touched, Mr. President. It must be touched. We will also be putting resources in, $6.9 million going back to the University of West Indies and Agriculture Training Institute and the UWI Center for Food Security and Entrepreneurship. We will, as well, Mr. President, be investing $11.9 million in the school's digital technologies program. We expect to have those investments made there as well. Mr. President, as part of this government's development trajectory and making sure that we are accounting not just for those people today, but those of tomorrow, we will also be developing, and you have heard the Honorable Prime Minister speaking about the creation of fiscal and growth councils. What happened in 2008 to 2018 must never happen in this country again, Mr. President. It must never be allowed to happen in this country again. And there are those who will walk around and who will act as though it wasn't me. They're playing it wasn't me, the shaggy game. It wasn't me, it was somebody else. Or they will associate themselves with a legacy that is so tainted and so stained that you wonder, what does that represent about how you would lead if you were given the opportunity, Mr. President? If poor management is what you associate yourself with, well then, Mr. President, I grow concerned about what you would give if foisted on the people of Barbados. Because then we can expect more of what was offered before. But this government, $1.3 million, has been provided each for the Fiscal Council, which will treat to, and their members who sit around exalted tables to focus on Barbados' fiscal management and make sure that outside of the hallways of political leadership, that there are those who have skills, expertise, knowledge, and visions in those areas, both for fiscal and growth areas, to be able to add their voices and their expertise in the interests of our people, Mr. President. And those are some of the high-level areas that we have seen evolving over time. During the course of the next 2 days, well, 3 days in total, you will hear from the representatives on this side a breakdown of the specific ministries that will be covered in the estimates. And I will not go into their specific details, but you will hear ministry by ministry by ministry, head by head, what the government is spending on and why. And so I want to kick it off today from my side to use the time remaining for my own presentation to speak about my own ministry, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, the Ministry of Energy and Business has perhaps one of the smallest allocations in the estimates of expenditure in terms of resources. $45 million have been earmarked for the Ministry of Energy and Business. And if you consider that all things in the country are energy-driven or business-related, that may seem like it is an inadequate amount, Mr. President. I want to enter, therefore, a document of the House, make a document of the House, a paper I'll read it out in a short while. But Mr. President, the Ministry of Energy and Business deals with all things energy related. And when I say all things energy related, I am speaking about both the traditional energy sector by way of fossil fuels, whether it is heavy fuel oil for asphalt, heavy fuel oil for marine, heavy fuel oil for bunkering, heavy fuel, gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel, all of those things are imported into the country for different purposes. It also deals, Mr. President, with the renewable energy transition process, and I will speak in great detail about that during the course of my presentation. But we are also the ministry with responsibility for business, and I am going to speak about issues ranging from Business Barbados, the cost of living, Mr. President, our monitoring of prices, the historical prices compact and where it stands now. And I'm also going to speak about the business environment overall and what it means to do business in this country. But I want to enter into the record as a document to the House, a document which is a central bank research paper. The title of the paper, Mr. President, is the estimation of the pass-through effect of international food and energy prices on domestic prices, the case of Barbados. I'll read it again. The estimation of the pass-through effect of international food and energy prices on domestic prices, the case of Barbados. I am not going to be part of any discussion that attempts to fool Barbadians into thinking that a government, any government, has full control over prices in a country where 90% of what we consume is imported, including inflation, Mr. President, including inflation. I don't want to dumb down Barbadians into thinking that if I promise you I can control prices, you can give me my vote when the next election gets called. I am not in that with them. Here's what I want to do, because I believe that Barbadians are some of the most intelligent people I know. And when you explain things to Barbadians without either talking down to them or trying to dumb them down, that they understand what is there, but they expect simultaneously that a government will do what is within its control to protect them, in particular, the most vulnerable, Mr. President. So in this paper, it talks about a range of things. It talks about international energy prices. It talks about international production prices, first cost, and then it speaks in turn about how those things in the pass-through effect impact Barbados. It said this, Mr. President, a 10% increase in international energy and food prices is estimated to lead to higher domestic inflation of 7.5% and 3.4% respectively. In the short run, in the immediate term, the impact is much lower at 0.6% and 0.2% respectively, but in the longer run, it is a significantly higher domestic inflation effect. It goes on to say, Mr. President, in addition, the direct effects of a general price level, indirect inflationary effects may also arise because international energy input costs are typically passed on from producers, not importers, it says producers, to consumers, which in turn may lead potentially to higher wage demands. They found that oil price innovations resulting from supply and global economic shocks impact consumer prices more readily than oil-specific demand shocks due to an offsetting appreciation. It goes on to speak about a range of things, Mr. President, that I won't get into, but I wanted to make sure that I captured this part where it says, the indications are that the oil price pass-through to domestic prices was increasing because of the significance of oil inputs in the overall business cost structure of external producers, thereby making firms more responsive to commodity price fluctuations. That is not the government of Barbados speaking. That is not the political class speaking. This is a working paper of the central bank, which estimated the pass-through effects of imported inflation in external prices onto domestic prices. Mr. President, we have no control as a government over those externalities. Prime Minister said in her other statements in the other place about exogenous shocks, she called it a big fancy word, and it is, but things that happen beyond our borders. We have no control. There are those, Mr. President, who know better, but don't want to believe because in their hearts, they want to support a Democratic Labour Party narrative. In their hearts, they are yearning for a Democratic Labour Party narrative, even though they know that what they're saying is not accurate. They may not be those that come out and call themselves Democratic Labour Party supporters, but you know by their thinking, when you see people who know better, who should say better, but don't, in their hearts, they want you to believe something that they know is not true, Mr. President. So what has this government done to manage the pass-through effect of international prices, both in energy and in commodities, on the domestic consumer, Mr. President? I sit in a position, Mr. President, where the Barbados National Oil Company and the Barbados National Petroleum Corporation both sit under my ministry in terms of the importation of oil prices, and the ministry with responsibility for commerce also sits under my review. Mr. President, I can say to you, and I have said it in a previous discussion, that we have in 2020, 2022, I think it was, I want to make sure I find it properly, find it and I use it correctly. In November of 2023, Mr. President, this is what I want to use because it gave us the oil import figures for 2023 up to October. It said to us, Mr. President, that fuel imports in 2023 as of October, the year had not yet ended, but the fuel import bill for this country was close to over $900 million. For the previous period, it told us it was about $800 million. In 2021 and in 2020, well, 2020 and 2021, those are the COVID years, it went down to $500 odd million when consumption and demand consumption was at its lowest. And prior to 2019, we were somewhere around $600 million. But at the highest, the volatility in international fuel prices, international oil prices per barrel in particular, meant that by 2023, we had the highest import bill for fuel products that had been recorded in the last 5 years. So, Mr. President, it meant that the inflation to which I have just referred was being imported as a consequence, as defined by that paper that I have entered as a document to the House, as a result of the oil pass-through inflation. Consumer prices also globally increased. Mr. President, we in the Commerce Department also did an assessment of what those external factors are. We found the fuel prices, yes, but we also then did an assessment, Mr. President, of what international freight prices look like. Mr. President, after the pandemic, international freight prices went to an all-time high of 500% increases. During the pandemic, we saw those prices being maintained between 200% increase at its lowest and 500% at its highest. Those resulted in a pass-through, Mr. President, that we qualify as imported inflation. Add oil prices, add increasing freight prices. By 2022, Mr. President, we started to see oil freight prices coming back down. By 2022, Mr. President, we started to see that from the Far East, from Europe, in particular Turkey, and Far East Asia, more generally, we saw those prices begin to stabilize. Still higher than 2019 levels, but we saw them begin to stabilize. The majority of our imports, however, Mr. President, in terms of food in particular, come from North America. Those prices remained at 300% above 2019 levels as at 2022, and they continued at that same level in 2023. These are the independent and objective assessments, Mr. President, of what the externalities are. But what did this government do? We cannot control, because we do not own the shipping industry, we cannot control international freight prices, so we can't touch that. But what did we do? We capped the freight prices at 2019 levels where we could manage the parts of it that are passed through once the goods are landed in country. What else did we do, Mr. President? We also then introduced a prices compact where we engaged with the private sector to have a cap on markups. Because if the private sector is bringing in these products which have increased first costs, increased shipping costs, increased logistics arrangements, and those prices have increased, then, and they turn and add a markup that could be in some instances up to 30%, it means that the pass-through inflation rate is even exacerbated further by an increase in markups. So we capped with their agreement the prices compact for 2 years. Their markups at 12.5% on the basic basket of goods. If I want to go and buy fancy items, Mr. President, that may be a choice. But the things that Barbadians use on a regular basis to feed their families were put into a prices compact and capped at a markup of no more than 12.5%. That was within this government's control to do, and that this government did. Mr. President, we also want to put into the mix here that the government then made a determination at the level of the port fees to then cap the port fees beyond, initially 7.5%, and then they went to a 15% cap on port fees, port charges. At least those goods coming through the Bridgetown port. We accept that many of the goods are sent directly to the consignee, and so those are the items that this government may not have control over because they're privately run, but through the government's port, the charges from the port were capped at 15%. Those are the actions, Mr. President, of a government that has committed to intervening where it can see that there's imported inflation, but where they have control, they have introduced measures. We, as a government, Mr. President, have introduced measures to be able to cap the pass-through on the consumers. Is it something that we are going to throw our hands up, Mr. President, and say, we ain't got no control over it, we can't do it, and we can introduce price controls? The economists, Mr. President, who sit among us when they had the conversation around it, every single economist in the room, even those that have objective views or have divergent views is what the word I was looking to use, do not agree that price controls are an effective mechanism to use to manage prices. They have not seen any instances where price controls have worked effectively in any market. So price controls, Mr. President, were not a mechanism that we felt could be used, and they could not be objectively imposed, but we sat with the business community, and we continue to sit with the business community. And as I speak now, there are proposals that the business community has raised that are being given active consideration on how we can further intervene where it lands at the border. As long, Mr. President, as the food item lands at the government, lands at our borders, that is where this government has given the assurance that we will intervene as long as we can. Now, Mr. President, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that alone because there's a big ticket item that I want to spend as much time as I can on dealing with, and that's the energy sector. I want to talk about the energy sector. Mr. President, I have given everybody, I always say to people, my phone number is like salt, pot salt at that. Everybody got my number. Just call me for yes and for no when it comes to the ministry. Mr. President, I want to make it clear that the policy of this government is not about favoring any individual entity or giving anyone a platform to raise themselves up on. The agenda of this government, Mr. President, has been focused on people, and I want to talk about who those people are. Mr. President, there was a lady who called me the other day. She called me because she had emailed the office and the others had spoken to her, but she wanted to talk to me to tell me what her issues were. She said, Minister, I retired a few years ago. I got her gratuity. She was a nurse, Senior Minister. She was a nurse and she retired. And from her gratuity, she wanted to use her gratuity funds to invest in a solar PV system to be able to put that on her roof so that she could supplement her now fixed income from pensions to be able to get an additional source of income by way of her PV as an investment. She said, but I can't get connected. Them tell me that they ain't got no more space on the grid. So I know how to pay the bank, Mr. President. I got to pay the bank, and I know drawing from my pension to pay my bills and pay the bank for an investment that I wanted to be able to be a source of revenue for me. What goes in must come out, right? In her case, she paid out and she was hoping that something was coming in. That's one person who is a nurse, Mr. President. I have EPC contractors who went and started new businesses. They are small business owners, Mr. President, and they wanted to take advantage since 2016 of what they saw was the upstream of a new and emerging sector in the energy transition industry, Mr. President. So they started new businesses, but because they can't get connected to the grid, they are thinking about having to lay off workers, people who they brought in to work with them, Mr. President. Some of them feel as though the companies that they founded are now insecure because they don't know where they're going to go next, Mr. President. I know of a case, Mr. President, where a larger investor in this instance, because it's not just small people, they're all Barbadians, had a piece of land that a family member left for them. And they took that land. They didn't want to build a house because the house would have been securitized differently, but the panels themselves constituted the security for the banks. So they went and they took up the land and invested in building a ground mount system, not even just on their roof, a ground mounted system, and they wanted to be able to get this thing done. They too have come close to the end of their career, and they want to be able to have an investment. They can't get connected, Mr. President. These are railroad people, though. I'm being told by some in here that includes them. These are railroad people that while we posture and parade, these are railroad people that can't get connected to the grid, and whose livelihoods, whose retirement funds, whose gratuities are being eaten up because they're paying out for that which they can't get back. It's a real issue, real people. My number being like pot salt means that my phone has been on fire for the last year that I have sat in this seat, Mr. President. I have had people who have gone to the Light and Power and have come back to me to say, I went to Light and Power, but they tell me they can't connect me, Mr. President. It's a real thing. I don't have panels on my house, and when people come and they haven't started yet, and they ask me what I would recommend, I said, don't do it yet. We actually had to make a decision in June of last year as a government to protect people, because policy is fantastic. And I believe that Barbados has one of the most aggressive and ambitious energy transition agendas in the world. There are countries that are watching us globally. When I go to IRENA, when I go to ADIPEC, when we go to COP, when we go to wherever, people are watching Barbados's energy transition agenda, and they're watching it impressively, because they're like, we want to do what Barbados is doing. We want to be where Barbados says it sees itself. So by 2035, we too want to be able to join Barbados in deriving 100% of its electricity from renewable sources. But there are the mechanics of getting that done. And what are the mechanics? Investment in grid expansion, upgrades of the grid, and most importantly, in this moment, Mr. President, the ability for us to onboard storage to be able to expand the capacity of the grid. This is not something that the Barbados Labour Party has said. It is not. I want to go, Mr. President, and enter as a matter of fact that we have spent a lot of time, Mr. President, with international experts who have not become experts in Barbados, who have not become self-appointed experts, but experts who have worked in the energy sector globally. Experts who have worked in countries that I can't call the number of countries that they have worked in. And I want to take this moment then to acknowledge their contribution. When we started to realize last year, when I joined the ministry, that we have the opportunity to be able to solve the problem of getting storage onto the system, we then were able to get the benefit of development partners who signed on. Mr. President, we have now the following partners working with us. I have shared some of them in previous contributions, but I want to go into even more detail about the ones that have since come on board since the last time I spoke. I did speak with you in November of last year about the Rockefeller Foundation, the Bezos Fund, and the IKEA Fund that has been funding the GIAP project, the Global Alliance for Energy, People and Planet. Prime Minister would have launched that partnership in COP last year in Dubai. And so we have them coming on board. But Mr. President, we don't have any storage experts in this country. We don't. We then were able to get the benefit under that partnership of dedicated, embedded storage experts to advise at no cost the government of Barbados. And I want to recognize the Regulatory Assistance Project, the National Regulatory Energy Program, both out of the United States with offices in 55 countries around the world. And so when I say that they are international experts, Mr. President, they are international experts and they have done this globally. One of them was birthed by the U.S. Department of Energy. This is NREL, National Regulatory Energy Project. Laboratory. They were birthed out of the U.S. Department of Energy, and they have worked around the world on storage supporting countries like Barbados. The International Financial Corporation, Mr. President, has given us dedicated storage experts and also modeling experts. And so they are working with us not just on storage, but also on wind, onshore wind in particular. All of those things have been brought to the table with this government. We started last year in December then to undertake the process in collaboration with this team, which then has included the Fair Trading Commission, all of the stakeholder partners, all of the government agencies, Ministry of Finance, everyone, because this is no one-man show. It is too complex and too multi-layered and too interdisciplinary to attempt it to be a one-man show. It really is interdisciplinary. And so we have treated to it in that way. How are these things to be accomplished? With the consumer in mind on the one hand. How are these things to be accomplished with the technology in mind? We now sit, Mr. President, through an NREL on a global industry technology transformation team with responsibility for sitting at the table at all times with all of the global producers of storage, so that when we are in a position to procure storage, that we are sitting at the table with the industry development specialists to be able to procure at the best price, the cutting edge technology through a negotiated partnership with Rockefeller. These are the things that are ongoing as we speak, Mr. President. So the notion that we're just going to market and picking up storage, for example, at the first price that we find it is a nonsense. It means you're sitting outside of what is actually happening. And I want to take the opportunity and the time to share what is happening so people are aware. We have been affirmed, we have been assured by our partners that in collaboration with them, they will sit at the table before us with industry partners, in particular lithium ion and all the new emerging technology batteries that are available to be able to procure the best technology at the best price. The proposal at this stage, Mr. President, is that it will be below market price because the implications of onboarding storage as an additional layer in the consumer pricing of electricity is something that we as a government, where we can control it, we face it, we fix it. We want to minimize the cost of storage to the procurer in order to minimize the pass-through effect to the consumer. And so it means, Mr. President, that the international partners that we have found, we have therefore brought them to the table to make sure we are getting the best cost and the best technology options that are available. And for whose benefit? The consumer's benefit, Mr. President, to be able to ensure that people who pay the electricity bill don't see a further charge on it. The fuel adjustment clause is already in there, Mr. President, and I have spoken about the increases in pricing for fuel prices globally. So if we saw in 2023, in October alone, over $900 million in fuel pricing coming in. That is going to be reflected in the fuel adjustment clauses on our electricity bills, Mr. President. So we have, as a government, to mitigate that pass-through to the consumer. And that is what is happening now at the level of the government. I do not speak on matters that are before quasi-judicial bodies, and so you will not see me doing that ever, including not in here. That is not my role, and so we leave quasi-judicial matters for where they rightfully belong. However, what I will say, and I will give the country the assurance, Mr. President, that all of the work that we are doing now is in the interest of, one, meeting the renewable energy transition goals that we have set, two, ensuring that we can lower the cost of electricity to consumers, and three, that we can address the climate crisis that Prime Minister has been speaking about and our teams have been leading on globally, because these are the things that constitute a future for Barbados and a future for our young people. Mr. President, in the few minutes that I have remaining, I want to spend some time on business Barbados as well. I do? Okay. I want to spend some time on Business Barbados because I'm going to connect it as well to the energy sector. Mr. President, Business Barbados, I've spoken about it here before. Mr. President, you, in your previous life, were a minister with responsibility for international business. You, in a previous life, were a minister with responsibility for industry. You understand the pain points that people are experiencing as it relates to business facilitation in this country, Mr. President. You are no stranger to this. You know this better than most. Mr. President, I have said recently I had the honor to be one of the persons who assessed the budget the day after with the Chamber of Commerce. It's a nonpartisan space, and I would not have attempted to politicize it. And so I dealt with it as it was and gave the respect to the Chamber that it deserved, along with my colleague, Senator Chad Blackman. When we spoke about Business Barbados, Mr. President, we talked about the issues that came up over time. Mr. President, I talked about the people who call my phone and my pot salt number. My pot salt number is on Kaipo too, Mr. President. Mr. President, when I first came to office, I said it then, and I say it now. 9 out of 10 calls came to me, not even on energy initially, but on Kaipo. All the things that were problematic about Kaipo. But Mr. President, I don't want to go into Business Barbados and what we plan to do without acknowledging the people who work in Kaipo. Because I am not that leader who bastardizes or trivializes the people who work in a space. I'm not that at all. I have people who will go into places like the licensing authority, Mr. President, and who would want to lambaste the officers sitting in front of them at a counter. And Mr. President, I am here to say today that our public servants, in my view, my experience has been that the majority of our public servants are just as frustrated in some instances as the public is, because they know what the systems need to be and what they would want to recommend and what changes they want to see made. Kaipo has been no different, Mr. President. Kaipo has been no different. Kaipo is an agency, Mr. President, that has been given the responsibility of facilitating business facilitation in the country. Kaipo is the entity that is a creature of legislation, creature of statute. The Companies Act, they are responsible for administering the Companies Act. In fact, they have over 18 pieces of legislation that they are responsible for administering, Mr. President. When I first came to this ministry, they also were dealing with, along with the International Business Unit, the issues facing the international business sector and the OECD. We were dealing with reporting on economic substance, Mr. President. We were dealing with ensuring that the FHTP reporting processes were completed. We were dealing, Mr. President, with ensuring that annual returns were filed and bills of sales were accessible to lawyers to be able to complete transactions. We were dealing with any number of issues, Mr. President, that were critical to day-to-day life in the country for business people, but also for international business. We were dealing with any number of issues, Mr. President, and Kaipo has not been staffed or would have been affected by staffing deficiencies, just like the regular public service would have been. They simply have not had the manpower to be able to do the kinds of things in the time frames that they would want to be able to do it. In 2019, Mr. President, there were monies allocated to do a corporate digital registry project. That project is ongoing and the transformation is still underway. We are now in a position, and I'm happy to announce that we are now in the process of beginning phase 3 of that corporate digitalization transformation process in Kaipo to be able to ensure that we're able to make the changes that are necessary. But here's what I want to make the point about, Mr. President. I am sure that when you were there, that there may have been 10 steps that were being used to complete a transaction from start to finish. In 2024, Barbados is not the Barbados in 2024 that it was in 1994. It's not this Barbados, it was in 1984, 1974. And so a Companies Act that has not been reformed in its entirety over time, that still calls for certain things to be done. We are now, Mr. President, we paused and we began the process of deconstructing and reconstructing. If it was 10 processes then, what does it need to be now? What are the things that are fit for purpose in 2024 Barbados? And so Business Barbados is now being repositioned to not just be a new name on an existing agency, but to completely transform what this agency is supposed to do. I am pleased to announce, Mr. President, that as part of this transformation, we're not just putting lipstick on a pig. We are, Mr. President, Right now, we have comprised, just as we saw in the estimates of expenditure for the Ministry of Education and Change Management team, we have assembled a full change management team. That change management team includes the following: a labor relations consultant who is responsible for leading the negotiations and the discussions with the labor union partners on what is going to happen with the workers who are currently there and who will transition by their choice into a new entity. What I want to say here is that no worker is meant to be disadvantaged at all in this process. The expectation is that workers either will opt to remain with central government or they will opt to go over to Business Barbados, but that is to be a choice entirely made by them, and they will be shepherded through that process by the labor relations consultant in collaboration closely with their labor union, Mr. President. We also have a change management coordinator, Mr. President, because changing structures and changing names is not change. We have to make sure that the culture, the processes, every element of the process is transformed. We have a change management lead and a transition coordinating team, Mr. President. We have a business forecast modeling lead, Mr. President, because we need to understand how this process is going to be capitalized. In this estimates of expenditure, Mr. President, we have $7 million allocated in expenditure on the creation of Business Barbados, and that is meant to be the initial seeding of the entity. By that, what do I mean? Mr. President, how many times have we had to go down to Baobab Towers for what we consider to be a simple transaction and had to go multiple times, Mr. President? We want to be able to take the majority of those services online. Mr. President, how many times has that older person who may not be as technology savvy as some of us would need to go into Baobab Towers because the technology just isn't working for them or they simply don't know how to do it, Mr. President? The new Business Barbados will have kiosks established, not just in Baobab Towers, but it is my vision that we also have kiosks established in different parts of the country where people, as they go about conducting their day-to-day life, in a mall, in a post office, wherever they are, they can find a kiosk on a distributed scale that allows people to conduct business in a seamless way if they need dedicated help. Mr. President, how many times have we seen that person who wants to go and open a small business and they have to go and find an attorney and the attorney has to help them incorporate the business? But here's what happens then, Mr. President. Once the business is incorporated, what happens? I cannot count the number of people who have come to me to say, well, when my business was incorporated, Lisa, nobody didn't tell me that I had to file annual returns. Nobody didn't tell me that I need to do that every year. And so by the time they realize it, years down the line, they have never filed annual returns and there's a penalty. We aim to get in front of that with a dedicated education program so people know what is required of establishing a business, but also there will be the establishment of a dedicated legal aid support program that guides people not just through the startup of a new business, but shepherds them through how to treat to it on an annual basis. So I may not know because I'm a new business owner. By definition, well, I know how, I'm not supposed to know. I'm supposed to figure it out, or I'm supposed to get advice, or I'm supposed to research it. But sometimes you have to be able to help people to help themselves. We as a government are committed to helping people to help themselves. So the dedicated legal support is going to not only help you to set up the business in the first instance, but it will flag you on an annual basis. It's almost time for your annual returns to be filed. Have you done this? It's almost time for you to submit this information. Have you done this? And a reminder, you're almost time. These are the things that are going to be there. As I speak right now, Mr. President, there is a dedicated team also looking at customer experience. That is a huge part of what every government needs to do. And customer experience covers a range of things. What is that people want us to do, though? What is that people are struggling with? What is it that people have experienced at Kaipo that you never want them to experience again? And so an entire team is dedicated to focusing on customer experience. They're running focus groups. They're designing what those new services look like. And the design of Business Barbados will capture all of those things that I have outlined. What will Business Barbados then be in a position to do, Mr. President, if we have our way as a government? The expectation is that there will be for Business Barbados a one-stop shop that caters from the biggest international business, if we so want to call it that, to the smallest small business coming that is incorporating as a sole proprietor. Everybody in a single space. Mr. President, I also want to be sure, if I have my way as the minister with responsibility for the creation of Business Barbados, that what we promise is what we deliver. There's nothing worse than opening a pack of potato chips, Mr. President, and half of it is air and cold. We don't want to do that. We're not doing that with Business Barbados. We're not over-promising and under-delivering. It is the reason why we're taking time to do this well and to do it properly, to deliver for the business community and for the people of Barbados who are doing business in this country, Mr. President. And if someone may say to me, and they might say so rightfully, that $7 million is not enough to be able to do this, they may be right, Mr. President, but that is why I have upfront said it is to be seeded with $7 million. And why did we say $7 million upfront? Where did that figure come from? When we were looking at Business Barbados and we were looking at CAIPO, Mr. President, CAIPO had an allocation on an annual basis coming from central government of approximately $4 million. $4 million was coming from central government to CAIPO. In contrast, what goes in, what comes out, we also then saw that the revenue generation from CAIPO through services offered by that agency amounted to $7 million, and that went into the consolidated fund. So we made the determination, Mr. President, that if CAIPO on its own is able to raise through fees and charges $7 million on an annual basis, we will seed it initially with that $7 million, and any additional resources that would then be necessary to take it through the rest of the financial year once the board has been established and the leadership has been in place, that would then be provided for. So you will see in these estimates that the $7 million is captured under the transfers to Business Barbados. Now, we were hoping to be able to get Business Barbados started externally by April 1. But the kind of work that I have just outlined requires us to do it properly, not empty bag of potato chips that cold on the inside. We want to make sure it is well designed and caters to people. People both globally and people locally. Mr. President, I can't tell you, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well, when some of the persons who represent the CTSPs, when they come in, corporate trust service providers, when these persons come, they represent companies that have operations in Barbados, in Cayman, in Turks, wherever else they're functioning. And sometimes it is hard for them. It is as hard for them as it is for the people starting a small business. And why? Because, Mr. President, they are struggling with the experience of their colleagues running practices in other jurisdictions where doing business is easier. Where doing business is easier than doing business in Barbados. And so they have to fight to keep business in Barbados a lot of times because engaging with these agencies oftentimes is so problematic. But you know what's important, Mr. President? What goes in comes out. This sector represents the second largest source of revenue for a government. It is not in decline, far from. $470 million in revenue was generated in corporation taxes in the last year. $400 million of that came from international businesses. This is not a small sector. And so the idea that Business Barbados therefore has to cater equally for those at the top of the scale in terms of revenue generation for the country and corporation taxes, as well as those in small businesses, is very much part of this government's agenda. But Mr. President, let us be clear, what goes in comes out is what I said, right, at the beginning. So coming in is $470 million in corporation taxes. Coming out, smooth roads that we're driving on. Coming out is healthcare, Mr. President. Coming out is $98 million for the University of the West Indies for economic fund, economic costs, and $32 million for tuition fees. Coming out, Mr. President, is expansion of the healthcare programs. Coming out, all of the what goes in comes out. What we want has to be paid for, and $470 million, Mr. President, in corporation taxes in the last year. We have to ensure that Barbados is the most attractive and most competitive place in the Americas and then in the world for businesses to do business. People have to feel as though they can do business in this country without having to jump through hoops. And so Business Barbados is being repositioned. It's not tinkering at all, for the purpose of positioning Barbados to, one, be an easier place to do business, facilitate people from top to bottom and everything in between far more seamlessly, but also, Mr. President, to be able to increase the government's take of corporation taxes in order to support the lifestyles of our people, the lifestyle to which we have become accustomed as a person. The lifestyle that the little girl coming behind me will never have to pay a University of the West Indies for their tuition, Mr. President. The little girl coming behind me does not have to pay her primary school or her secondary school for tuition. Those are the things that come out from a government that protects economic policy. Mr. President, I had a conversation with somebody maybe a year, this year. It's this year, Mr. President. It's just this year. Actually, a few weeks ago. They're sitting in this chamber. And I remember saying to them, Mr. President, in 2008, when I looked at the manifesto of the Democratic Labour Party in that election, 2008, I remember thinking, this looks as great as social policy. But social policy is expenditure. It's not revenue. How are we paying for this expenditure? I saw nothing about growth. Do people want to talk about growth? No. I saw nothing about economic development. They want to talk about economic development? No, Mr. President. I saw nothing about new sectoral development. They want to talk about new sector development? No, Mr. President. How do you pay for social services without an accompanying economic development and a growth agenda? And that, Mr. President, is what this government has balanced extraordinarily well. An expanded social services program as captured in these estimates and as outlined in these estimates, buttressed and supported by an economic development program, because we have to pay for the services that our people are entitled to, Mr. President. We have to be able to pay for the expansions at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. We have to be able to pay, Mr. President, for the expansion of our education sector and expansion of our corporate curriculum. We have to be able to pay for, Mr. President, the ability to underwrite what happens to consumers in energy prices. We have to be able to pay for everything that our people have historically become accustomed to. The allocation to the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs, Mr. President, we have to be able to pay for that, to be able to deliver services to people, Mr. President. The expansion in the Barbados Police Service, we have to be able to pay for that. The ability to fight crime, both on the prevention side and on the justice side, Mr. President, we have to pay for that. The legislative reform processes, Mr. President, right now we are in the process of working through the introduction of new legislation in my own ministry, introduction of new companies legislation, introduction of amendments on the Economic Substance Act, the introduction for the first time of the Electricity, Light and Power, well, not the Electricity Supply Act. First one is now in development, Mr. President, and we have not depended on our own skills alone for this. We have a draft, we had a legal consultant, we have a draft, and it's there, Mr. President. But you know what we had to do as well? We had to depend on the support of our international partners to look at what the best practice is around the world, because we're not governing just for today, Mr. President. We have to position Barbados for tomorrow. And the Electricity Supply Act that we are now in the process of developing went out for comments in the public space since August of last year. We had a legal engagement in January of this year, where there were those who wanted to have comments on the legal part of it. We had a dedicated session for them. And we now have taken that text, Mr. President, as a consolidated text, and we have shared that with the Regulatory Assistance Project that we're working with under Rockefeller. We have shared it with the Global Alliance for Energy, People and Planet. We have shared it with NREL, and they too, Mr. President, have given detailed and substantive comments that are now being worked through in the draft. So we are taking nothing for granted. Those are things which all have to be supported as part of a government, Mr. President. And I want to take the opportunity here, Mr. President, especially in my energy team. We have 5 or 6 officers who are leading and anchoring most of what we are doing at this point, Mr. President. And I want to take a moment to go through what some of those things are. In 2022, my predecessor would have started work on local content. They would have spent some time on developing a local content framework, local content strategy, a local content fund, and a local content bill. Those are matters which we are now considering, in particular as it relates to a specific tranche of work that we have started called the future of work, Mr. President. We want to be able to ensure that the future of work for energy is well developed. In 5 years, what skills will this country need? This is why we have to tinker, we have to touch and transform the education sector, Mr. President. The education sector today is not producing the energy skills that we need for tomorrow. We need to make sure that we are constantly on the cutting edge of creating those skills, and so we are modeling it now, Mr. President. We have just completed the updated version of the Integrated Resource and Resilience Plan. That has been completed. We want to recognize the consultants that worked on that project. Mark McDonald, they would have developed, Mr. President, the update. We did that in 2021 last, and we have just last month completed the development of it, Mr. President. We have also an update of the National Energy Information System. That work is about to be completed, taking a lot of our work online. I personally feel as though, Mr. President, we have an LPAC portal which was developed in 2021 and is further being updated now, because I want to be able to see, as the market monitor, how much the grid has once it is expanded, how we match generation with storage capacity. I should be able to see that on a dashboard. And so our energy information system is now being updated to accommodate that. We have approved in these estimates, Mr. President, the creation of an electricity planning unit in the Ministry of Energy that is going to see, for the first time, energy and grid modeling specialists embedded in the Ministry of Energy, so we are able to develop our own internal capacity to model. We have just had, under a partnership with Sustainable Energy for All, the UN Special Envoy for Energy, who, as I was talking, was just calling. I'll have to call him back when I sit down. But we have a partnership with them, and we just sent one of our economists to Vienna, where their headquarters is based, to be able to be trained in grid modeling capacity, and they have just come back and they're working with the ministry. We are building the skills and the tools that the sector needs for the future. This is not a one-man show. This is interdisciplinary and it's comprehensive. We continue then, Mr. President, with our partnership with Sustainable Energy for All. Sustainable Energy for All came to us in 2023, I believe, January 2023, shortly after I joined the ministry, and offered their help. We readily accepted that help. Mr. President, I'm pleased to advise that we have just completed the Energy Transition Investment Plan for Barbados. What this plan does is it provides the roadmap that gives the granularity that is required for implementation of the Barbados National Energy Plan. I can now tell you, by looking at the Energy Investment Plan, what it will cost this country in terms of expenditure by sector for the energy transition. If we have we've done 3 models, 3 simulations. In a business as usual simulation, we know what it will cost if we continue as we are. In a net zero transition through 2030, we know what it will cost, and a net zero 2035, we know what it will cost. We have broken it down in granular detail, so we can tell you by sector, by transportation, by industry, what is needed and at what cost, and we then will have an implementation plan, Mr. President, to be able to deliver on that. That is ready and is to be taken to Cabinet this month, along with the updated IRRP, Mr. President. I want then to come to the development of an energy sector storage roadmap. I don't think I've spoken about this in this chamber, and I want to take a few moments to do so. Mr. President, we have close to just under 750 megawatts of energy in the pipeline on the horizon. 206 of those have been approved. 333 are in the application stage, but on the horizon, I could see 650 people who have come with different types of projects. But the grid can only absorb 100, right? So immediately the math is not mathing. So we know immediately we got a problem. So storage is an immediate and an urgent no priority. So what does that mean, Mr. President? It means that the 650 that is on the horizon is in a queue behind the 333 in the application stage, and the 333 in the application stage. They're behind the 206 that are already approved and need to be connected. We are working, therefore, Mr. President, with our partners in Rockefeller to be able to develop an energy storage roadmap. And what does that roadmap say? It says, how are we in an objective and a transparent manner going to be onboarded those 206 megawatts and those 333 megawatts and those almost 700 megawatts onto the grid. The IRRP gives us an updated capacity demand. Now, we forecast down to some of the most granular things. We have the World Cup coming up in June of this year. We can tell you that based on what we are modeling now, what the projected demand for electricity is going to look like in June. We can tell you how the tourism sector performed, Mr. President, over the course of the last few months in terms of consumption demand and what we expect. We can tell you what new energy sources are coming in on the generation mix and how that needs to then be matched with storage. Energy storage is an urgent priority now, not just for the major investor who has money that they want to invest in Barbados, but the nurse who has picked up her gratuity and needs to be connected to the grid so she can get a return and stop drawing from her reserves. Urgent storage on the grid is an absolute priority. When I say, or when the government says that we have a challenge with regulatory lag, here is what we mean, Mr. President. In June of 2023, the Fair Trading Commission would have issued a pilot for 50 megawatts of storage, a pilot. We were already, by June of 2023, close to capacity on the grid. And we already had feed-in tariffs for up to 1 megawatt and then up to 10 megawatts, Mr. President. So the issuance of a pilot decision on storage in June of 2023, long after we already had a ton of generation in the pipeline, is what we describe as regulatory lag as well. The ability to make decisions in a timeline that matches policy with regulation is what we term as regulatory lag. But let me be clear here, as I was in the Chamber of Commerce. The Fair Trading Commission has asked for, and in these estimates of expenditure, you will also see the investment in the development of capacity at the Fair Trading Commission to be able to get the skills that they need. We have already, Mr. President, secured the support from the Regulatory Assistance Project to work directly in an embedded way with the Fair Trading Commission to allow them to undergo a complete transformation. They simply have not had the in-house capacity to do the things that they are required to do. Mr. President, when we added hydrogen into the energy mix, they did not have a hydrogen expert in the FTC. They had to depend, I'm thankful for the work of the Inter-American Development Bank, who then brought Deloitte out of Spain to work with them to be able to deliver the methodology for developing the feed-in tariff for hydrogen. They have had to externalize for storage, for rates, everything to experts outside of the system. We are committed as a government to investing in the resourcing to adequate levels of the Fair Trading Commission and the transformation of the Fair Trading Commission so that that too is a fit-for-purpose 2024-2025 institution. And we are thankful for the support of our development partners internationally for coming alongside without hesitation to support them in the interim. Mr. President, equally, we have partnerships that have been developed right now, on the future of work, which include the following partners: Robert Gordon University and Aberdeen University from Scotland, the CSME unit, the Commonwealth Secretariat, the Indian Development Fund, and we're working locally with the ministries with responsibility for labor and their RE sector skills development and the Ministry of Education. Education transformation is a must. What we are hoping to be able to do, Mr. President, and I'm pleased to say here, we're in the development stage of developing a partnership with our local tertiary level institutions that allow for training to take place here in Barbados and internationally with our development partners that we are now designing the program with, to have 2+2 programs, 2 years here in the development phase, in the theoretical phase, and 2 years abroad embedded in offshore wind and say in Scotland, where their farms are extensive, and all across Europe, India, wherever the capacity is. We have already discussed with the government of India as well, Mr. President, their expansive work in energy storage. And so we are building out those programs as we speak, Mr. President. There are a couple of significant bodies of work that we will do during the course of this year. You will see coming from the ministry a grid code, a dispatch code, and you will also see during the course of this year decommissioning guidelines as well, because we have to ensure that the environmental work that is necessary is completed. So, Mr. President, these are some of the things that I wanted to be in a position to share with this honorable chamber and with the colleagues here. I will, as you know, have an opportunity to speak in a closing of the debate on these matters. But I want, in my final minutes on this presentation, to cover the following things. I want to be able to cover our work program for the year in this ministry. I want to be in a position, Mr. President, to say how my own work program collides with the government's estimates, Mr. President. The government's estimates of expenditure, as I have outlined, will range from investment in education, investment in people, investment in services, investment in healthcare, all of the things that I have outlined. You have heard the Bridgetown Initiative, and I'm not going to go into the Bridgetown Initiative and the things that I have left out, have deliberately left out, because my colleagues are going to be speaking to those things in great detail. But I want to make it clear, Mr. President, I want to make it clear. This government, this Mia Amor Motley-led government, this Barbados Labour Party government, from 2018 till now in 2024, is committed to ensuring that Barbados is on a path of fiscal management that is sound. It is on a path of economic development that is visionary. The notion that, Mr. President, we would have economic diversification, sectoral diversification that was akin to when I was a student in secondary school, where sectoral diversification simply referred at its most simplistic stage of let's do agriculture, let's do tourism. That's not what growth trajectories look like in this incarnation, Mr. President. It's not. And so when you talk about the way in which our economy is structured, a combination of investment in particular leading strongly on balancing private sector investment with public sector investment, what you have seen is that the confidence levels in this administration's management of this economy have been strong. And what do I mean when I say that, Mr. President? When you drive down the South Coast, while you may hear the chatter about the hotel projects that started but haven't started, that we talked about but haven't, have you seen the South Coast recently, Mr. President? Besides the smooth road that you're driving on now, let me not forget that. The smooth road coming on Highway 7 that was just redone. They have to finish another section of it now, Mr. President, and I have to confess that I am a part of the reason why it has to be waited, but we have to wait, Mr. President, is because the National Petroleum Corporation sits under me. And the National Petroleum Corporation is in these same estimates mentioned specifically as undergoing a national mains replacement transformation program, which has to go underneath the roads. And so the design of the upper section of Highway 7 now needs to take into account all of the utilities that have to go in under the road. We have that underway, Mr. President. So we are committed as a government to ensuring that the development of the country, the economic growth of the country, all the hotels that I was referring to up on the South Coast, Indigo has started, Mr. President. We're seeing at least 3 different construction projects on that road. And let's be clear, Mr. President, some of the same people who will ask you, well, what about this road, what about that road, they see a new road in 10 years before we came to office, Mr. President. They see one all of a sudden, but what about this road, what about that road? When the Dems were in power, they're asking them to, because they didn't do much roads then. But a country with a government that went through a shutdown of 2 years, that went through a pandemic, that had $600 million taken out of the bottom of its economy, still can find the room to do the new roads. But the Dems will be saying, but what about this road? You ask yourself the question, what about the new roads that you fix, not the ones up in St. Philip? Ask them. We can't do it all, Mr. President, but I think our record so far, challenges notwithstanding, speaks for itself. All the work that we have done is visible for all to see. So the roads, the garbage, the transformations that are underway in every single sector, Mr. President, make a clear statement that with this Barbados Labour Party, What goes in taxes and in debt, has come out visibly. This is not that government, Mr. President, that what goes in by way of increased debt, you can't see. This is not that government, Mr. President, that when you see new buildings, you can't use them. The men going in. You can't see all the steel that you see going up. You can't actually see a building delivered, Mr. President. This is not government. This is not that government, Mr. President. Not at all. Far from. So, Mr. President, I want to use my remaining 10 minutes, because that's what I'm told I now have, to go over the final sections of the government's fiscal program. I want to talk specifically about the work of the Growth Council, and I want to make sure that that collides with the work of Business Barbados and the energy sector. Mr. President, there are two things that this ministry, my ministry, and the government overall has been focusing on as it relates to these two entities that we are now creating. I want also, Mr. President, to speak for a moment about the public service, because I know one of my colleagues is going to speak about public sector transformation. Mr. President, I must confess, and I say it publicly because I've said it privately, sometimes it's hard for me to take the time when I leave the office to deal with energy and storage and all the business issues that keep coming at you, to go, Mr. President, and sit with my colleagues and to go through public sector transformation. Because, Mr. President, my honest feedback initially was, I didn't hear about public sector reform since I was in the public service as an officer myself. I was hearing about this from a long time. What has it delivered? Mr. President, we now sit in a government that has undertaken under the umbrella of public sector reform to have both a bottoms-up and a top-down transformation of our public service. What is fit for purpose? Under these estimates, Mr. President, every single government ministry, every single one, was asked as they presented their estimates of expenditure before the Prime Minister in her role as Minister of Finance to do a deconstruction and a reconstruction of your ministry. What is the core objective of your ministry? What are you required to do for the people of Barbados? How do you break that down? And we all had to submit a deconstruct and reconstruct document as part of our estimates. We have the commitment for results framework, because you plan, but how much are you implementing? How much are you delivering? And so now, as part of these estimates, the monitoring mechanism going forward requires us to do a couple of things. One, implement, deconstruct and reconstruct. How do you make all of the changes that you need to make internal to a ministry to be able to deliver? So you have MPEA, transforming an overall social services sector. My ministry, transforming an energy sector. We have, and I believe I have said it here, the Cabinet has approved that the amalgamation of BNOC and MPC will be undertaken during the course of this year. So we have that amalgamation underway, as well as the launch of Business Barbados. All of those structural transformations are there. But you are not just creating these new entities, Mr. President. How are they meant to work? How are they meant to serve people? How are they meant to serve the staff members, the employees who work in the agencies? How are they frustrated? What needs to be done to fix that level of frustration, Mr. President? All of those are things which are now inbuilt into our work programs for the financial year, and you will see them allocated in the estimates over the year. You will see the normal program estimates, which you have here in these big purple books. That's fine. But beyond that, at a ministry level, we have the dashboard for the commitment for results framework. We have the deconstruct and reconstruct documents. Those are all required, and all of our public officials are required to go through what that looks like and to change their operating procedures. They're not public documents, that's the nature of government, but they are operational documents which guide the officers in a given ministry. So we know what is required. In addition to that, Mr. President, under the umbrella of the Growth Council, my own ministry is now also responsible for taking the time to go, therefore, and to have a review of what is required externally, which is why you heard me speak earlier about the importance of having customer experience consultations. What are the customer experience consultations, Mr. President? What are people saying about the experience of interacting with government, Mr. President? Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes people are so frustrated by having to interact with government that it is painful. Honestly, it is. Sincerely, it is. And we have to be able to make sure that a government that is then structuring a transformation program has people at the center of it. And that those people at the center of it, Mr. President, then are in a position to be able to say what they need from us as a government. And that is what we're doing, Mr. President. I want to also make the point here, because we're sitting in Parliament and there are those who aspire to be here, that the West Wing of Parliament has $3.6 million assigned for its refurbishment. And you're going to see the refurbishment earmarked of the West Wing to continue over the course of this year, and that wing, which has been under construction for some time, is going to be completed, we expect, in the coming financial year. So, Mr. President, finally, the Growth Council in particular raised a range of issues, and specifically the top issue that they raised was business facilitation. They prepared a report, they commissioned a report, I should say, and they submitted a report and punctuated throughout that all of the woes, all of the issues that people have been interfacing with government. That is the reason why, Mr. President, you have seen business facilitation featuring so prominently, because people have given the feedback. And I want to say, Mr. President, in closing, this is a government that between 2018 and 2024 did not have a parliamentary opposition. This is a government that between 2018 and 2024 did not have a voice in this chamber or in the other place to speak in opposition to its policies, and did not have a voice in this place or the other place to speak about the things that they felt people wanted to see. But, Mr. President, people don't vote for an opposition, they vote for government, and they voted for this government. And in voting for this government, Mr. President, they made a determination that not just once, but twice, the people of this country, Mr. President, made a determination that in the first few years, notwithstanding the issues that we have navigated, that this government came to the people in multiple fora, whether it was walkthroughs, Mr. President, whether it was Parish Speaks, Mr. President, whether it was at the constituency level, Mr. President. I sit in a cabinet among colleagues who are required every single week on a given day to be in their constituencies. We did not start doing that 6 weeks ago. We have done it for 6 years without interruption, Mr. President. We have accounted to people, we have listened to people, we have allocated expenditure for the issues that confront people, and we have centered our growth trajectory and our transformation agenda around people, Mr. President. That is the ethos of the Barbados Labour Party. That is the ethos of this government, Mr. President, and we commit at all times to ensuring that this government, which we are proud to be a part of, Mr. President, at all times, as I started, I want to finish, positions ourselves for the Barbados that we are proud to stand on as institutional scaffolding, that we are now standing on the shoulders of those who came before us. That this is a Barbados in which people who sit today and watch us are well pleased, even if we acknowledge everything is never going to be perfect. That's okay. Things are not going to be perfect as long as you are always striving for excellence, and as long as you're always setting the bar high, Mr. President, and delivering and talking through people when you don't hit that bar and making sure that you recalibrate and come again, because you always have to hit that, Mr. President. But a Barbados that is visionary, that allows people to dream, that allows people, Mr. President, to see themselves in where we are now and to project themselves a little later on. Not a Barbados that is being dumbed down. Not a Barbados that is attempting to speak to the lowest common denominator and to simplify or oversimplify complex issues. No, 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 no. The Barbados that I talked about as a little girl, that I always wanted to be a part of. The Barbados that commits me to going back to school and supporting young people who want to be able to see in me and to all of us what they aspire to, Mr. President. The Barbados that international partners look on and say, I like that country though. I like what they are doing. I like their leadership. I like how they are positioning themselves. That, Mr. President, is the Barbados that I am pleased to be a part of now, as opposed to the Barbados that I cried long tears, as many of us did prior to 2018. I am proud, Mr. President, to be a member of this government. I am proud to be a member of this Barbados Labour Party, and I am proud to support this appropriations bill, and I commend it to this honourable chamber.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummings. Recognize Senator Watson. Before you do that, though, Senator Cummings, you need to beg that the bill be read a second time.
Blame Senator Walker. I beg to move that this bill not be read a second time.
Senator Cummings, Senator Watson, before you begin, I'd like the Deputy President to take the chair for a few minutes.